Hi, it's Simon here, and just before we get into the episode, we really need your help with something. We have a survey out that we'd love you to jump on and do. It's all about life and faith, and if you're listening right now, you are the perfect person to do this. The survey won't take long, probably about 5 minutes, and it would help us a lot as we shape life and faith and think about how we can do it better. The survey will be running till mid-November, so if you have a few spare minutes, go to the show notes to click on the link or go to the CPX website, publicchristianity.org. Now, for those who do, there will be the opportunity to win what I think is a fabulous prize. So thanks for your help. Now to the episode. This week on Life and Faith.
I think there is something to be said about myth and romanticism and idealism within political leaders because it's aspirational. And so it inspires people to be better than they otherwise might be.
If we only knew the things that would make for peace.
It retains many of its values. It's just taken death, judgment, heaven and hell out of the picture.
I'm here to make killers out of people, and you're here to make them feel good about it.
What happened to the other 97%?
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
Well, we are in the countdown to perhaps the biggest election of the year in this year of elections, the US presidential election. It's been a wild ride, Justine, with assassination attempts, Joe Biden withdrawing himself from contention and Kamala Harris's ascendancy. It's been hard to keep up, actually.
Yeah, I think it feels as though there is so much riding on this, which makes sense, really. The US is still the leader of the free world, quote unquote. And I bet the outcome of this election will be closely tracked everywhere, right? From Ukraine to China and, of course, closer to home as well. And it is also a live question, of course. If the election doesn't go Donald Trump's way, is he going to accept the outcome?
Yeah, it's a little bit unnerving that there's no obvious answer to that. But I feel that sense too of the heightened stakes of this election. And of course, there's a prominent role played here by American evangelicals, although just who these self-described evangelicals are is a good question that we've explored with Michael Ware and Darryl Bock earlier this year on Life and Faith. It's funny, Justine, years ago, the question we used to ask at CPX of every historian who came in to be interviewed was, did Jesus exist? That was our sort of standard question. Now we're asking a bunch of people the same question, what is an evangelical? And to hear what they have to say.
Yes, and this is one line of questioning I pursued with Peter Wehner, who I interviewed for today's episode. Now, Peter Wehner is a former Republican who worked in 3 Republican administrations, so Reagan and both Bushes. These days, however, he's a never-Trumper, so he's part of a group of conservative-leaning people who have, on the basis of their conservatism, declared themselves against Trump. Peter contributes op-eds and articles to the New York Times and The Atlantic. He's also a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum, which is based in the nation's capital, Washington D.C., the room where it happens, so to speak. So when I spoke to Peter, I asked him, can you give us a sense of the mood on the ground in the lead up to the election?
I would say that the mood is anxiety for both sides. It's a tremendously close race. In the national polls, Kamala Harris is between a 2.5 and 3-point lead, but that may not be enough for her to win the election because in the past 2 presidential elections, 2016 and 2020, the polls tended to undercount the support that Donald Trump got. And so the final polls had a larger lead for Democrats than actually worked its way out in the vote total. There are 7 so-called battleground states, that is, very important states that will decide the election. Most of the country, it's going to be blue or red, Democrat or Republican, and there's no real contest that's going to happen. But in 7 of these states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Arizona and North Carolina and Georgia, the race is really, really tight. I mean, it's within a point or 2 points either way. And, whoever can get to the 270 electoral votes is going to win the election. It's not clear who's going to get there. So anxiety, I would say, just for both sides because of the nature of how close it is. And then beyond that, because there's so much at stake and that each side has generated a lot of concern and fear about what could happen if the person that they're against wins. That's, I think, amped up the anxiety.
Can I ask what it's like for you, in that you've worked in 3 Republican administrations, I believe as a speechwriter for President George W. Bush and others as well, and yet your latest writing, or your writing for quite some time, I should say, has looked very dismally upon the Republican Party?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I was actually one of the first prominent, semi-prominent Republicans to break with the GOP over Trump. My first piece that I wrote critical of Trump was in the New York Times in July of 2015, 3 weeks after he announced. Interesting backstory, which was there was a resistance at the Times to publish that column that I wrote because people thought it was just waste of real estate, that Donald Trump would be a passing phenomenon. There was no way he was going to win. He wouldn't even be a particularly important influence in the election. And my sense was, no, he's going to be a bigger influence than a lot of people think. So, I was out early and often in my warnings about Donald Trump. First, it was really warning the Republican Party about Trump, why they shouldn't nominate him, and then even why they shouldn't elect him. But over time, what has happened, which was entirely predictable, was that the party fused with Trump. And in a sense, his attributes, his qualities, the defining features of Donald Trump became the defining features of the Republican Party. And for somebody like me, who's very concerned about that and think that Donald Trump is a tremendous threat on all sorts of levels to the country, I broke increasingly not just with Trump, but with the Republican Party. There's been a cost to it, obviously, because that's a world that I lived in, a lot of friends in that world, and past places of employment, ideological commitments, and so forth. But this decision has been about as easy a decision in one sense as I've ever made, because it's been so obvious to me what Donald Trump represents, the threat that he poses to the country, to the ideals and principles and values that I cherish, and even as a person of the Christian faith, the damage that I think that he is doing to faith that's important to me.
I do want to ask more about that, but I just want to rewind a little bit. And can you speak about the Never Trump movement? Like, how did you first become associated with this group? Where is the movement at now? Because it feels very quiet from away across the Pacific where we are in Australia.
Yeah, it's not quiet, but it's very small, right? It's not quiet because there are a number of people who have platforms. I have one person like David French, who's a columnist at the New York Times. There's an outlet called The Bulwark. Charlie Sykes was formerly a part of that. William Crystal, Sarah Longwell, names that wouldn't necessarily mean a lot in Australia, but in this country they do. Liz Cheney, who was in the leadership in the Republican Party until she broke with Trump, and then the party turned ferociously against her. So there's noise coming from us, but we're such a small slice of the electorate. I mean, basically we could fit in a phone booth. So that's the state of it. It's an unofficial movement. It just happened to be that there were a group of people, many of whom still consider themselves conservative, as I do, who just felt like that they had to break with Trump, in part because Trump is an anathema to many of the conservative ideals that we throughout our lives have pledged allegiance to. And I think they do speak clearly, but I don't think anybody within that movement has any pretense that what we say is going to influence the Republican Party at all at this moment. It is, in my estimation, essentially a cult of personality. And when you're dealing with a cult of personality, reason arguments don't really make a lot of difference. It's sort of like shooting BBs off the side of a brick wall. They just bounce off.
In a recent column, you wrote that the Republican Party has been, quote, delighting in their dime store nihilism or nihilism since 2016. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, nihilism is a philosophy that was articulated, among others, by Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher in the 19th century. And it is essentially a world that is severed from objective values and objective truths, and that morality is created. He had a phrase, the will to power. So it's the Übermensch, the powerful, that can live the lives that they want, dictate how societies live, and that might makes right, and that the moral basis of a society means very little at all. And it's very kind of capricious and ad hoc in terms of what kind of ideals, principles that guide people. And so I think what has happened is the Republican Party, which once upon a time, I mean, when I was a young person, the concepts of objective truth, of inherent moral dignity, human rights, certain objective values, some things right, some things wrong, some things true, some things false. That was pretty central to conservatism in the 1980s and 1990s and before that. And so to see the Republican Party that once championed that philosophy not only turn from it, but to completely break and become the antithesis of it. Because I think Donald Trump, in his person, in his actions, is a person who is completely both amoral and immoral. Amoral in the sense that I don't think the categories of morality even register with him. I think he's a sociopath in the clinical sense. And immoral in terms of how he lives his life, which is in a way that's cruel and lawless and narcissistic. And as I said earlier, though, I think the Republican Party has fused itself with Trump and taken on those characteristics. And in America, there are now, Donald Trump has spawned countless mini-Trumps, people who are basically parroting what he says and how he acts. Now, nobody can do it quite as badly or quite as well, depending on where you stand vis-a-vis Trump, as he can. So it's a kind of cheap nihilism, and it's reckless. And I think it just has done a lot of harm to our political and civic culture in America. You see the manifestations of it in all sorts of ways, including the kind of pulsating hatred and anger that defines politics today in ways that are unusual.
Let's talk about Trump's support among self-professed evangelicals.
Uh-huh.
I believe the narrative from 2016 was that something like 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And the narrative goes that they wanted their pick of Supreme Court justices. They wanted someone to represent and fight for their interests. And even though he wasn't quite the candidate that they would have preferred,
Right.
he was someone who could get the job done. Is that roughly correct? I mean, it might be simplistic, but does that capture something of the flavor?
I think so, yeah. I think that really does a nice job of capturing the situation in 2016. That's no longer the situation now. But yes, I think the way that it's described, in America, a phrase that you heard is that his moral failings were a bug, not a feature, kind of a negative rather than a positive. But net, you took the things that they thought that he would deliver on. He was worth supporting because of a series of policies that white evangelicals supported. And they thought that he would be, much better than Hillary Clinton, who was a real vilified figure on the American right and within conservative Christian circles. In any event, quite apart from Donald Trump. There was also a narrative at that time, which I thought was silly at the time, but a lot of people embraced. And that was the notion that Trump would grow in office. That is, that if he did become president, he would become a more dignified and restrained figure just by virtue of the office itself and the ethos of the office, the history of the office, that he would surround himself with people who would check his worst instincts and hopefully amplify his best instincts. So that's a story that a lot of evangelical Christians and other Republicans told themselves would happen. So that tremendous enthusiasm that we now see for Trump among Christian white evangelicals, that wasn't as common a feature in 2016, but they grew to love him.
Before we go on, can we clarify who are the evangelical voters? As in, is evangelical an expression of religious identity, or is it some kind of self-adopted term that captures their political or cultural Christianity, but doesn't necessarily translate to a deep religious faith? Or can you explain that for me?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not an easy question to answer, quite honestly. I mean, traditionally, if a person was a self-described evangelical, it had a theological and doctrinal connotation. So you thought immediately of people in terms of, say, how do you interpret Scripture, certain doctrines about the person of Jesus, his divinity. That was traditionally how evangelicals were defined. That is, first, I would say, doctrinally and theologically, and then there was an outgrowth or manifestation of certain issues in this country, often evangelicals are associated very strongly with the so-called pro-life movement on abortion. That is, they are against abortion because they think it's the killing of an innocent human life. But increasingly, this would have happened, I think, even if Donald Trump had never come onto the scene. But the fact that he came onto the scene has amplified this, which is evangelicalism in America is now defined in large measure and in some circles almost exclusively as a cultural and a political identification. So people are almost cultural Christians. And so you're seeing an interesting alliance happen, which is people who doctrinally may disagree profoundly on certain issues. That's set aside, that's secondary. And what matters is, where do you land on the question of the Make America Great movement, so-called MAGA movement that Trump represents, and the culture war issues that are happening. So I would say that what's happened is the evangelical movement has morphed from primarily theological to political and cultural.
And when you say that it would have happened regardless of Trump or not, is that because there's a sense of being a little bit under siege? The world is changing. Is that too much to say that?
No, for sure. You're exactly right. There's an enormous amount of fear, anxiety, and grievances that are pulsating through the evangelical world. It's not uncommon for evangelicals to refer to themselves as persecuted and under siege, and a sense that the country is on the edge of a cliff morally, and that if the election goes the wrong way, that so much of what they love and care for will come apart. I mean, it's a silly narrative, and it's an unhistorical, ahistorical narrative, among other things. I think you would be hard-pressed in the entire 2,000-year history of Christianity to find another time and another country where Christians are as protected from persecution as in the United States in the 2020s. It doesn't mean that there isn't from time to time some conflict that happens. There's obviously passionate debate in this country over certain issues that white evangelicals consider important, that so-called progressives disagree with them. But the religious liberties in this country are tremendously strong and protected. Churches and religious institutions get exemptions that other groups do not get. And you look at the history of Christianity, which has been in part a history of genuine persecution against Christians, and unfortunately of Christians persecuting others. But for the purposes of this answer, where Christians have been tortured and beaten and killed, that's not happening in the United States. But the community itself, there's almost a tropism toward the persecution narrative. And so they tell themselves within their own communities these stories about how awful things are. There's definitely a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, a lot of grievances that have built up.
This is Life and Faith, and we're listening to Justine's interview with the writer Peter Wehner, who served in 3 Republican administrations but broke with the Republican Party over its fidelity to Donald Trump. What has been the impact of so many American evangelicals throwing in their lot with one political party? Here's Peter.
I think the costs have been enormous. Because I'm a person of the Christian faith, a follower of Jesus, I think it has been the most painful thing, because I think what has happened is that in twinning itself to Trump and the MAGA movement, I think the witness of the Christian faith, Christian churches, and Christians as individuals has been tremendously damaged. I mean, people look at it, whether they're Christians, often young Christians, look at it, and certainly people not of the Christian faith, and say, who are you guys kidding? During the 1990s, when Bill Clinton was president and he got tangled up in this affair with Monica Lewinsky, an intern at the White House, it was white evangelicals that were using bullhorns to scream moral judgment against Clinton, saying he had to resign from office because what he did was immoral, and that primus inter pares, first among equals when you're choosing a president, is morality, integrity, honor, even if his policies are working great for the country. people remember that. I remember it. I was central in the conservative movement at that time. And now you get a guy like Donald Trump who makes Bill Clinton look like a Boy Scout. And they not only look the other way, they defend him and they rally for him. So people see this and they say, what happened to your morality? What happened to your ideals? What happened to those convictions you were telling us about? You just jettison them for your guy, for power. So people see that and they say, well, why would I want to be a part of that faith or that movement? So I think it's been a huge damage to the Christian faith, and it will take a long, long time to repair the damage, if it gets repaired at all.
Plenty of Americans might feel that there are no good options, right? That neither of the two main candidates are compelling. So what then do you believe people should do in that case?
Well, I mean, I think people have to vote their conscience. If they feel like they cannot in good conscience vote for either candidate for whatever cluster of reasons that they've adopted, then they probably shouldn't do it. I wouldn't ask somebody to necessarily go against their conscience. I think that argument, and I've heard it dozens of times, hundreds of times from people, including people who won't vote for Donald Trump, traditional Republicans, but they just can't bring themselves to vote for Kamala Harris because they've convinced themselves that she's essentially an equal threat to the American Republic, though in a different way, or they feel like they have too strong disagreements with her to allow them to do that. I think that's a profoundly mistaken and short-sighted view. I don't think under any kind of rigorous analysis it holds up for several reasons. For one, Donald Trump is, I think, so obviously a unique threat to America. I mean, he is a person, after all. Here's what we know about him. This is not speculation. He was found liable of sexual assault, what the judge on the case referred to as rape. He was paying hush money payments to porn stars. He invited powers that were hostile to the United States to interfere in the election. He's tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power. He's cheated on his taxes and on his charities. He's been indicted 4 times. As bad as Trump was in sort of 1.0 version of him in his first term, a second term would be much worse, precisely because the kind of people that he had around him in the first term, sort of traditional Republicans, Chief of Staff John Kelly, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of State, Attorney General to some extent, they kind of checked his worst instincts. I mean, to be very concrete and practical, Donald Trump had given orders to the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which is the highest military position in the United States, and the Attorney General and the Secretary of Defense to have thousands of military deployed onto the streets of America to shoot peaceful protesters. Now, in the United States, you can't use military like you use police. That is a red line you can't cross. And he not only wanted to do that, but he wanted them to shoot protesters who were peaceful because he was angry at them. That's a matter of public knowledge. In addition to that, he was inciting the mob that attacked the Capitol to hang his own vice president. He sent out tweets that we now know because of the January 6th committee that looked into this, from internal emails and communications among Trump staffers, that he was trying to provoke people to hang the vice president. Now, I don't know how much further you have to go to say this person, even if you have to vote for somebody who's a Democrat, more progressive than you like, Kamala Harris is within the normal boundaries of American politics. But an awful lot of people have convinced themselves, oh, she's as bad as he is, or I just can't find it within myself to vote for her. I've, just in the last few days, I've had email exchanges with people I know who've made that argument. And I think if Trump wins, it's going to be a tremendously destructive argument, and we'll pay an enormous price for it. But this is what people have convinced themselves of.
The people who are critical of Kamala Harris and who won't want to vote for her, what's their best argument for not doing so that you're happy to concede?
Sure. I mean, she is a liberal. She's a person center-left, and she held positions, particularly in 2019, when she ran for the Democratic nomination. where she really made an appeal to the progressive left-wing movement in the United States. And she embraced a number of policies which she has subsequently in this campaign distanced herself from. So, if you cared about a conservative Supreme Court, which matters in this country, and federal court appointments or on abortion, basically there are no limits to where she thinks a restraint should be on abortion. If those were issues that you care about, then it would be understandable. And in most normal circumstances, a person of conservative orientation would not consider voting for her. So if people say she is liberal, I mean, that's a valid argument. My own sense is that in this campaign, she has taken positions which has put her much closer to the center than she was. And I don't think her positions that she's embraced are remotely as irresponsible as one could have argued in the past. But she's in the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party in the United States is a liberal party. And if you're a conservative, you'd have problems with that.
Do you fear for the future of your country?
Yeah, I do. If Donald Trump wins, I think he'll do tremendous damage. And I think there will be very few checks on him. There will be no check within his own party, the Republican Party, because it's a kind of wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump. There's nothing that he can do that would cause the Republican Party to break with him. We've heard this probably 100 times since he's been president, sort of theories that Trump has finally gone too far in what he said and what he's done, and Republicans would finally break with him. It's never happened, and his hold on the Republican Party is stronger now than ever before. In addition to that, there was a relatively recent in terms of months ago, where the Supreme Court basically argued that the president would have immunity from the laws for official actions. Now, however, that will eventually work its way out. What Donald Trump heard from that decision is that he can do anything as president and be immunized from law. So the kind of actions that would get any other person arrested in this country if they committed this act or committed this crime doesn't apply for the president. That's how Donald Trump is going to read that decision. It may, in fact, be exactly what he should read from that decision. The presidency, I've worked in the White House for a Republican president. I've worked for 3 administrations. I think I have some appreciation of the power of the presidency and how, if it's abused, it can do a lot of damage. And there's nobody in American history that is as prepared to abuse power as Donald Trump.
Justine here. At this point, I asked Peter what it would take for the Republican Party to win him back. Now, obviously, breaking with Trump would be one part of that, but what else would it take? What I wasn't banking on was what Peter then went on to say, that Donald Trump has changed in some fundamental way the Republican Party. For Peter, it's no longer a conservative party.
He has changed in a very deep way the ethos and moral views and attitudes and sensibilities of the Republican Party. And even if he were to drop off the face of the earth, on November 6th, the day after the election, that would not go away. The Republican Party is a fully magnified, fully Trumpified party. The people who were really opponents to it, resistance figures to that party, people like Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, a lot of others, they've left the Republican Party. Some of them have just retired from politics. Some have broken with it. So in a sense, the Republican Party is more radioactive than it has been. One other point that I want to make, which I don't think is really understood even in this country, let alone countries like Australia, Donald Trump and the Republican Party, he is not a conservative figure, and the Republican Party is not a conservative party anymore. It's a populist party, and he's a populist figure. And populism and conservatism are not only not synonymous, in many ways, they're antithetical. And many of the greatest conservative figures, either political figures or philosophers, and people who shaped the intellectual contours of conservatism, whether you're talking about people like Michael Oakeshott or Edmund Burke, and certainly the founders of the United States, James Madison, and then later, probably the greatest figure in American history, Abraham Lincoln. All of them, to one degree or another, warned against a mob mentality, about the passions of the people being stoked up, the dangers of a kind of mass psychosis. We've seen it happen in other countries and in other moments. The reason that the American government is set up the way it is, it puzzles a lot of people from other countries, which is its checks and balances, the separation of powers, which sometimes slows legislation up, slows a lot of things up. That's the cost, but the benefit that the founders believed of America was that it would prevent demagogues, or at least created more obstacles for demagogues to take control. And it's worked pretty darn well in American history. Trump is the exception. So he is not a conservative figure. He's in many ways the chief enemy of conservatism, as a lot of us have understood it. And I would say for the Republican Party to become a responsible party, from my standpoint, by my lights, it would once again become a conservative party. But right now it's hostile to conservatism, philosophically, in policy, and in terms of sensibilities.
I read in an article you wrote something about how, was it Reagan who was really captivated by the idea of America as a city upon a hill.
Right.
Like, is there something to that captures in a nutshell what conservatism kind of meant to you? Is there something that you can explain about that?
Yeah, no, I can. Yes, Reagan used a line. It was actually from a Puritan, John Winthrop, who used the phrase "city on a hill," and Reagan talked about the shining city on a hill. And Reagan was a monumental figure in American history and certainly in conservatism. He won the presidency in 1980, won a second term, carried 49 out of 50 states, and left an enormous imprint both on the country and the Republican Party. He was an interesting figure because there is a tendency, I would say, within conservatism philosophically to be a bit negative and a kind of dour attitude, somewhat pessimistic about human nature, human life generally. Reagan was not that way. He was a person who was deeply optimistic, even in some ways romantic in his views of America and of other things. And I think that was actually a good thing to inject within the conservative movement, precisely because it was a little bit unusual. And he had the capacity to inspire millions and millions of people, particularly younger people like myself, by that vision. And he had an idealized, romanticized view of America. I would say, looking back, he in some ways mythologized America, probably presented it in a better light than, objectively speaking, it has been. But I also think that he had some deep insight that America was a pretty exceptional country and has done some pretty exceptional things, even while acknowledging that it's made some horrific errors. I mean, slavery was the original sin of America, but there have been many, many others. But that's the nature of human life. It's the nature of countries. But I think there have been real moments of glory and sacrifice in America. And he understood that. And I think there is something to be said about myth and romanticism and idealism within political leaders, because it's aspirational. It's, in a sense, telling people, when you give a myth of what a country is, you're essentially saying to them, this is what we can be. This is what we've been. These are the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln said. And so it inspires people to be better than they otherwise might be, and say, look, this is part of our tradition. This is part of our heritage. This is what matters to us. And so it can inspire people. Trump, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. You listen to his rhetoric. He talks about America as a failed, broken, violent sort of cesspool. And there's no idealism in him at all. And that's part of why Americans are kind of at each other's throat, figuratively, sometimes literally, but mostly figuratively today. You know, Trump has this capacity to get into people's heads and to occupy an enormous amount of energy and time. And he stokes anger, he stokes grievances, he stokes hatreds. I mean, he really is a master at that. And so, you know, he's done a tremendous amount to display the worst of America, to appeal to the darkest instincts of America. And that's, you know, that's playing itself out. It really is weird for somebody like me, who was a Republican and a Reaganite, to see the party that rallied around and elevated and respected Ronald Reagan to now rally around Donald Trump. It's hard to imagine two more contrary figures on the American political landscape. And what makes it even weirder is many of the same people who claimed that they were loyal, fierce Reagan supporters are now loyal, fierce Trump supporters. And I think that they've convinced themselves that they haven't changed. So, the human capacity for self-deception is pretty extraordinary. We're seeing it in this country now.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
Thanks to Peter Wehner. It's been great speaking with him. And I told him we are watching with bated breath the outcome of the US election. I'm going to post links in the show notes to recent articles that Peter has written and also his social media profile so you can keep up to date with his work. And also other interviews that we've done on life and faith in relation to the US election.
Yes, and if you like this episode, please leave us a rating or review. It really does help others to discover life and faith. And as always, a big thanks to our producer,
who makes Bill Clinton look like a Boy Scout,
Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
We don't want to concentrate power in the hands of too few because we know that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, that's an expression of the Christian doctrine of sin. Actually, we need accountability. We need structures because without those, even the best of us run off the rails.